Hello everybody and welcome to today's SIG talk for quality and testing. We're going to talk about automation with Jenkins as well as continuous integration. We've got over 200 people registered and almost half of those are now online, so we aren't going to open up questions verbally, but we will give you an opportunity to ask questions in the chat window as well as via Twitter. And if you feel we've not answered any of those, I'm pretty sure that Chris and I, who are hosting today's event, will be happy to follow up and speak to you offline if necessary. So I'll get straight into the slides and the demo. So first of all, I'll introduce myself. My name is Richard Bishop. I'm a test specialist working for Lloyds Banking Group in the UK. I've been testing for well, what feels like an age, and is, I suppose. I've been testing since the year 2000 or thereabouts. I've been working primarily in the finance industry for Lloyds Bank and its subsidiaries, but in spells away from the bank, I've worked for health organisations, retail, entertainment, various different industries, so I've got a varied background. I'm currently president of Vivid, and in my role at Lloyds Banking Group at the moment, I work in a central team which supports load runner and performance centre users throughout the group. We've recently taken on responsibility for looking after UFT and ALM as well, and part of our responsibility is supporting people and helping them get the best out of each of those tools, and a lot of that in the last 12 or 18 months has been integrations between those tools and other DevOps tools, primarily Jenkins, which is going to be the focus of my demonstration. We also do work on test tool strategy, so we evaluate various different testing tools for either functional or performance testing, and share what we find with other people within the group. So you've heard plenty from me so far. I'll hand over now briefly to Chris, who'll tell you about what he does at Independent Health.
Thank you, Richard. My name is Chris Trimper. I'm also on the Vivid board as your education director. In terms of testing, I've been testing for a little over 13 years, of which 10 of those years have been in functional test automation. I do a bit of performance testing as well, and I've been working with the Micro Focus and HPE tools for the past 7 years. I've started up various automation teams, building standards and techniques and providing guidance. And my current role is focusing on building our framework, as well as integrating with different development teams and providing the guidance for all of the functional automation that we do.
Thanks for that, Chris. Okay, so I'll do a little bit of housekeeping first of all, and then switch over to my presentation. So if you do have any questions, feel free to send them to us via Twitter. Whichever one of us isn't speaking, we'll try and read those and get them into the chat, and so we can make this as collaborative as possible. You can also ask questions in the chat window in the webinar, which I'll tell you about in a second. But if you tweet Vivid SIG Talk either now or with feedback, we'll reply to you. Just another reminder as well, this is obviously a live session at the minute. You'll probably hear a few little mistakes that we're bound to make with it being live, particularly when it gets to the demo that I need to do later. But it's intended for all Vivid members, and when you go to our website, you'll be able to view this as an on-demand recording afterwards. So if any of your colleagues are unable to watch this and you think it might be useful to them, feel free to share those links with them. And the slide deck is also made available after as well, so that's something that you can pick up in the follow-up email. So as I mentioned earlier, if you have any questions as we're going along, mention them on Twitter or in the webinar control panel, which you can see a representation of that there. So you can basically start asking questions in the chat window, and we'll do what we can to answer those live. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of background, I originally gave this presentation, or one very similar to it, at the Micro Focus Universe event in Monaco in March. And the idea of it was to tell a story of how Lloyds Banking Group has been adapting how it does testing now that we've adopted a lot more DevOps techniques. It describes some of the difficulties that we face as testers and how we're overcoming those difficulties, some of the improvements we've made and some of the things that we are still aiming to do. So in view of the fact that we've got a large audience, I'll explain a little about Lloyds Banking Group. A lot of you won't be UK based, so you may not have heard about us, but we're the UK's largest financial services group. We go back over 300 years based on mergers of various precursor banks effectively. And we've 25 million personal customers and 5 million business customers. So we're obviously a large organisation. So this presentation describes how an old, established and traditional institution has adopted the more modern concept of DevOps and agile working. And one of the first difficulties that we faced was trying to introduce DevOps to a very traditional IT audience. So it's not very easy to summarize what DevOps is. And the green screenshot that you can see in the middle of that slide is basically a video that we've used internally to try and explain what DevOps is to traditional IT people. And one of the quotes in that video is, if you ask 100 people to define what DevOps is, you'll get 100 different answers. And all of these answers are right or wrong, depending on your perspective. And there isn't really a formally defined standard, but what we can agree is that DevOps is using more modern techniques to do more work more quickly and with fewer errors than before. And I think that's a generally agreed concept. And the way that we do that is by introducing automation wherever possible, increasing collaboration between different teams and so on. And one of the things about DevOps is it's popular in startups. So, you know, small teams who work in very agile, flexible ways, you know, have been doing this for some time, and it works. And so the question that we had to face was, how do we get it to work in a large organization? And there's various ways that we can do it. You split the various IT groups into smaller teams, maybe co-locate people. But you can then end up with 2 or 3 teams all going off and trying to integrate 2 tools or do something in a clever new way. And that's duplication of effort. So one of the things that we found is that knowledge transfer between those teams is vital. And so knowledge transfer and sharing became something that we really had to focus on. And I think the other thing that we've had to remember is that DevOps isn't all about tools. If you go to a DevOps conference or event of some sort, all you'll hear people talking about is tools, you know, Jenkins and Gherkin and Puppet and Chef and all sorts of things. And, you know, you'll have a lot of people pushing open source and all those kind of things. And that plays a part, but it's not about the tools. It's about the culture and how you can change that to allow people to take ownership as they would in a small team. And the benefits that we've found through adopting DevOps are they all come from better collaboration. And there isn't really one magical tool that will fix all of your problems. And I think that's one of the things that you need to be aware of if you're starting on a DevOps journey. So there's a couple of images here that show some slides that I'll go into a bit more detail on later on. One of the things that we've done in terms of introducing DevOps to traditional IT is overcoming objections. There's people who say, well, you know, we're happy doing things the way we always have done. And we need to remind them why that's not necessarily the best way. And I think it's quite easy to do that when you work with people to say, you know, where are your pain points? What are your difficulties? And try and use automation or clever use of tools to take away some of those pain points. One of the other things that we've done is run a lot of pilot projects. And as we've done those pilot projects, we've then recorded video demos and things like that and shared them on our intranet. And we've also made a lot of use of effectively internal cloud environments where we can spin up a server, do something experimentally, and then throw it away. And so being able to do that kind of thing has let people try things that they perhaps might not have done in more traditional IT environments. As I mentioned earlier, we've done a lot of knowledge sharing. So we have these lunch talks and sessions where we travel around the country and go to different different parts to make sure that lots of different people get opportunities to get together and basically chew the fat. And that's the type of thing that we're trying to do with SIG Talks at Vivid as well. The idea is that people sharing experiences is a very good way of helping other people build knowledge and feel empowered to try things experimentally. This next slide shows one of those experiments, basically, where I was asked whether or not it might be possible to test a series of APIs for the bank, and there was a team that was basically going through lots of different APIs and tweaking and improving their performance, and they found that they were using functional test tools. SOAP UI was one of them, and they were also using a framework called Rest Assured, which works in IntelliJ, to test REST API calls. And one of the things that I did as part of that was work out how to record what they were already doing in SOAP UI and IntelliJ to create load runner scripts that means that we could then hit those APIs pretty hard and run automated performance tests as part of each build. And so every time new code goes into an environment, you can run a performance test and make sure that whatever you've done to change the API, you've not made its performance worse. And that way we're making incremental performance changes with every release. Okay, so one of the slides that you saw a sneak preview of earlier is this one, where basically you take what looks like a standard project. Now, this is a made-up project. It doesn't actually exist, and a lot of these, some of the tools that are on there we do use, but not for every build. But effectively, what you've got is a complex process where you start off gathering requirements, then you deploy code to a development environment. You build a development environment, you check in code, review it, and then deploy it and test it and all those different things. And one of the things that you'll find in any large organization is that in every handover between different teams or different environments, there's an opportunity for a delay to creep in. So every time someone has to manually press a button and kick off a test or deploy some code or whatever, there's an opportunity for delay because someone has to ring someone in a different area or send them an email, and that in itself can cause a delay. And also, if one of those steps goes wrong, you may well have to go back to the start and start the whole process again. So one of the things that we're trying to do is not necessarily take away these potential points of failure, but get to them much more quickly so that you find the errors sooner and you can fix them more quickly. And then go back to doing what you're meant to be doing, which in this case is testing or performance tuning or whatever. And this is another slide. It's a simpler version that basically shows the benefit of taking testing from the end of a test life cycle or development and test life cycle and doing it throughout the process. And it shows that rather than queuing up a series of 4 or 5 changes into one large test and then running your tests, it's better to run a smaller number of incremental tests and try and free up some time at the end of the test life cycle. Okay, so just before I move into my demo, this is an animation that I created to basically give you the idea of what you can do in terms of automation. So if you've gone through the sort of slides that I've shown before and you've educated a team that it's a good idea to start automation and start potentially using a tool like Jenkins to pull together lots of different types of tests, one of the things that we've done is sort of demonstrated that it's possible to pull lots of different tools together using something like Jenkins. And in this demo, we've demoed each of these individual components like code deployments, code validation, functional tests, performance tests. And one of the roles of the team that I work in is going out and helping people integrate all these tools together, proving that it can be done and then leaving them to go off and do it for themselves. So in this example, we've got a Jenkins server in the middle of the screen, and at the start, it's basically sitting there and talking to a Git repository, so a code repository. And that's all it's doing. It's just constantly sitting and waiting to see if there's anything for it to do. So when a developer does a code commit into Git, Jenkins picks that up because it's constantly polling, realizes that code has been committed into the repository, and so it knows that the next thing it needs to do is run a deployment. So in this case, it calls urban code, pushes that deployment out to a test environment, and once that's happened successfully, Jenkins is aware of it and it knows that the next thing to do is a regression test. So we use various tools for regression testing. There's teams who use Selenium and other open source frameworks. We've obviously got a lot of people using UFT as well. So Jenkins can then call UFT directly and run a test and pull the results back into Jenkins itself, or alternatively, it could call ALM and run a test that way. That's more something that's in Chris's area of expertise. So when we get to questions around that, then I may lean on him. But so once the regression tests are passed, you can then potentially say, all right, we can run a performance test. So there may be another step here where potentially code's deployed into a performance test environment, or maybe not. But once a performance test runs, the results come back to Performance Center, or you can use LoadRunner for this too. And then Jenkins takes those test results, puts them in the Jenkins dashboard, so both the developer who made the commit that started the whole process off, as well as the tester who writes and maintains the scripts and looks at performance over time, both of those have visibility of how things have run. So I don't know whether anyone has any questions at this stage, because I'm about to run a video which shows a demo of me doing this for real within one of our test environments. Someone said they like this slide. Where's the like button? So thank you for that. Well, in the absence of other questions, I'll move on to the video. So, okay. So just to talk you through this is a demo that I recorded in February for the presentation in March, but it's all still valid. This is the screen that you get when you've installed Jenkins. In this case, I've got Jenkins installed on one of these cloud servers that effectively is a throwaway server that I mentioned earlier. So I've installed Jenkins, and I've installed a plugin called the HP Automation Tools plugin. I think it's been renamed to HPE Automation Tools, and soon I'm sure it'll be renamed to Micro Focus. But sorry, I'll just go back a little bit. On the left-hand side, you've got all the things for managing Jenkins, adding people, and so on. Down in the bottom left-hand corner, you've got a list of the places where jobs can run. And on the right, you've got a series of jobs. So we've got tests that can run in LoadRunner or Performance Center or whatever. This next tab shows another one of my demo servers. It's very much not a banking application. This is Magento, which is an open source e-commerce shopping cart application. And the reason I've chosen this for use inside the bank, there are several reasons. One of them is data protection, and this is obviously made up data. It's a dummy application, so there's no issues with that. But it's also very difficult to script in both LoadRunner and UFT. And so it's a really great tool to set up in an environment and then train people to use your testing tools. So looking into this job here, you can see I've got a pipeline job, which is one of those jobs that runs sequentially. I've called it Magento. And further down, you can see the script here says, at the first stage, I want you to do a URL check. The second stage, I want you to run a UFT test. Third, run LoadRunner, and so on. So what will happen is it will check that the site is up. Assuming it's up, it'll run a UFT functional test. Assuming that passes, it'll run a LoadRunner, and so on. So looking at the URL check, that's the URL that it's going to go to. It's just an internal server name, and it will check that that's up and running. It'll then run a UFT script, which does a search for I think it searches for a shirt or something along those lines. It does a search, and it will run on a machine which I've labeled, as you can see there, that says UFT 14. So I've got Jenkins slave agents, which some have load runner installed on them and some have UFT on them. So this is the first of those slave agents. It's a UFT one. As you can see, there's a little Java agent running, and there's a series of scripts in a folder called the Jenkins. And basically, this is the other one, the other machine I've got. This is the load runner one. You can see from the icons. It's got a load runner scenario as well as a load runner script. So I can run a script to prove it works, or I could run a more complex scenario. So if I say, okay, I'm going to run this, click build now, the first thing it does is the quick URL check. So that proves that the Magento site is there and responds. And the next thing it does is it's going to kick off a UFT test. It takes a while to wait for this. It's always, even though it's a recording, I'm always nervous that it's not actually going to happen. So the slave agent sitting here, when it receives a call from Jenkins, it runs the command line that starts off a UFT test. As you can see, it runs pretty quickly. It just does a search for a shirt, so only takes, as you can see, less than a minute to run. Once these tests have run, the Jenkins plugins pull the test results back from where they've executed and store them in Jenkins. You can go a step further than that, and you could push those results into ALM, for example, if you wanted to. But you can see here, it's a standard UFT result set. You can see the page it went to, that it clicked search and so on. And that's pulled back to Jenkins. And obviously, because the UFT test was successful, the pipeline script has gone on, and it's now running a load runner test. You can see that the first load runner test, which was, as I say, literally just running a script, has already run. That's the sort of thing you might run to make sure that your scripts functionally work still after a change in code, for example. I've sped this step up because it takes about 5 minutes, I think, to run this test. But so it's run a standard load runner test. One of the things that you have to do is set service levels within your test so that Jenkins knows whether something has passed or failed. Once it's finished, as I say, it pulls the test results back. And as you can see, you've got what looks like a standard load runner result set pulled back and visible in Jenkins. You also get this trend report, which is really useful because it shows you that for each build or each time you run the test, it stores the average transaction response times. So you can see in this example, I can't quite remember what happened with build 16 and 17, but the response times were really slow for those. So if this was for real, rather than just my test environment, those are the two builds that you wouldn't have pushed into production. And just for completeness, this is it's also integrated with Performance Center in this case. And you can see that I've gone into the Performance Center itself, so you can see the test run. So test run 197 is running live in Performance Center in this video recording. And those of you who were sharper-eyed on the earlier screen would have seen that run 197, it's there down at the bottom of the screen, is the one that's just been kicked off by Jenkins. So I've used this as an example of what is possible to promote the use of automated functional testing, automated code deployments, and then driving into automated performance tests. And this is one of the ways that I've promoted its use internally within Lloyds. So one of the things that I've done by setting up this type of environment is really just demonstrate to people what is possible, and then you can encourage them to go off and try these things in their own applications with our support. So that's the way that we've managed to get more people adopting these DevOps principles within the test cycle. So I haven't seen any questions pop up, but now would be a good time if you have any before I think of handing over to Chris. There's a lot of you online, but you all seem to be staying quiet. Okay, I'll close that down, and I'll get ready for Chris. Chris is going to discuss one of the ways that you can prepare for functional test automation within a continuous integration environment. So I'll hand over to you, Chris. Feel free to ask any questions that you might have thought of, and I'll likewise chip in if I think of any in your part of the presentation.
Oh, fantastic, Richard. Thank you very much. And actually, we do have some questions coming in. Maybe let's take a moment and answer one or two of them, just as it's appropriate, considering you just did your demo.
Okay.
Do you want to take a minute and field those? That way, while things are still fresh in their minds?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. That's right. Okay, fine. I hadn't clicked. I was looking in the wrong panel to see where the questions were being asked. So right. Okay, there's a few questions. The first one is, what plugins are required for Performance Center to integrate with Jenkins? Basically, for that, you just need the HP Automation Tools plugin, which what I'll do is I'll show you where you'd find that. So
yeah, while you're bringing that up, Richard, I was actually doing some research to see the latest, greatest on it. And the HP Automation Tools plugin now supports direct UFT, UFT from ALM, direct LeanFT or LeanFT from ALM, integration with StormRunner Functional, integration with ALM Octane and ALM.net, integration with LoadRunner Performance Center and Mobile Center. So pretty much all of their products, whether it's direct integration with a functional or performance tool or via the, I guess you'd say, administrative component, which might be ALM. You know, they have grown this quite a bit and made it so that if you are a traditional HPE Micro Focus shop, you know, Jenkins is a way to go that can really, really help you out. And it makes it pretty easy. You know, one thing that I appreciate with this plugin is that not only do you get the results that you're looking for as a tester, but someone that's very CI-centric or DevOps-centric or a developer is also going to get the integration with their tool like Jenkins to have it trigger that a build was good or bad. You also get the integration with the times, as you saw in the pipelines, and it's really fairly simple to get rolling.
Yeah, one of the things that we've got working is if a test fails, we can log a defect in Jira, because that's what the developers like to look at. But we could also potentially log one in ALM, because that's where the testers typically look for defects. So we can do all those kind of things. Yeah, so in answer to the question around which plugin is it, it's this one here, HPE Application Automation Tools. Version 5.4 is quite new. I think my demo was done with 5.3 or possibly 5.2. The people who are developing this plugin are primarily based at what was HP R&D in Israel, but is the Micro Focus R&D team, and they're very responsive. If you raise any defects or questions or on their GitHub pages, they come straight back to you. So that's one thing that's worth knowing. So yeah, you just need that plugin. Someone's asked, does Jenkins use its own built-in reports or just report what other tools post back? Effectively, it just reports what other tools post back. But there are some clever things you can do with Jenkins. So, for example, you could do lots of conditional type reports. So if a report comes back and it's a pass, fine, send us a flag. If it comes back and it's a fail, roll back a deployment or something, something like that, or raise a defect. And, there's a lot of intelligence you can put into it. One of the other things that I've seen demoed, but I've not done a lot of yet, is using a tool like ALM Octane, which can report on these types of tests. You can run a Jenkins pipeline through Octane and get more visibility into it through that. It's very much a modular thing. So Jenkins by default will present the reports that you give it, but it is possible to write really clever frameworks that go off and do other things. Someone's asked, if something in the test fails, does it stop the pipeline? Yes, the answer to that is yes. I'm not sure whether that's visible in my video, but I will see if I can see it there. I'll go back to video demo, and so here. I'll just pause it at the appropriate point. Is it that there? Yeah, effectively each of those stages are conditional. So this point here, I'll just let it get to the right bit. So what you would see, and I can't scroll on this because it's a recording, but if this one, for example, had failed at the UFT script, that would be green. This one would be red, and each of these steps 3, 4, and 5 would be grayed out. So yes, each step is conditional. But that's great because it gives you immediate feedback about where it's failed, and you can then click on the you hover over this area and download the logs and see what it was that made it fail. So that was that. There are quite a few questions. Sorry, if you use one pipeline job to kick off another 5, could you export results from all 5 back to your test management tool, ALM or Octane? Yes, you can. So good question. I think I've kind of covered that. Can you only call VUGen from Jenkins? No, you can call just about anything from Jenkins. So with the HP Automation Tools plugin, natively you can call VUGen or Load Runner Controller and tell it to run a scenario session, or Performance Center if you want to do performance type tests. You could also do UFT or Lean FT for functional tests using that same plugin. But you can also run things like PowerShell scripts or anything that runs as a batch file or anything that runs as a command line you can run. So there's lots of plugins. So Jenkins will do a lot more than I'm demonstrating here. It says, would it be overkill to use this plugin to only push test results to ALM? Is there a more lightweight alternative? Not quite sure I understand that question. Possibly. It might be overkill, but again, if all your results need to be stored in ALM for audit purposes or reporting or something like that, as is often the case in large regulated organizations, then you may want to put it there because that's the single version of the truth. That's where everything is held. But yeah,
if I could add to that, Richard.
Yeah. Sorry, go on. Yep.
I was going to say, to add to your thought on being able to store results, I think if we understand that question right, it would if you have the desire to have your results in ALM as well, as long as you trigger the test via ALM as opposed to directly kicking off the UFT test, it will manage sending your results to ALM as well as Jenkins. So Jenkins will actually read live from ALM as opposed to some temp file. So for that regard, it really depends, thinking through your process and determining where do you need your results at the end of the day. If you only need them to contribute to the pipeline, you can go direct UFT. If you need to have them in both places, you can certainly do it that way. If you're just looking to ship results from ALM, so you have them in a central place, you may or may not want to have it another way. But one thing that we've found with integrating with something like Jenkins is that you put the control of automation in a lot more folks' hands by opening it up through Jenkins. So that's one food for thought to add to that.
Yeah, we've got a couple more questions, Chris, which I'll go through quickly. Somebody's asked whether or not this works with Storm and Load as well as Performance Center and Load Runner. The answer to that's yes. So that's a quick one. And the final question is, if the code is being deployed to multiple test environments, would you have multiple pipelines, or can Jenkins handle this in one? The answer to that is probably quite complex. You could do it either way. You could either have a very large Jenkins job that builds in one environment, runs some tests there, and then builds in another and does some tests there. In theory, you could have something that deploys into, pre-production, assuming it works, deploys into production. So you could go all the way to, final deployments into a live environment if you chose to do so. Most big organizations are a bit risk averse about that kind of thing, particularly regulated industries like those that Chris and I work in, health and finance. But yeah, you can make it as complex as you want, but I would just say it's probably better to have a larger number of smaller, less complex things than one really big one, because then it's easy. It's easy to fix and maintain. And then one more question that literally just came in. Actually, Chris, you may have answered that by email, but
that's okay. I can
someone says,
cover it. Yeah,
go on. Yeah, you speak to that, and then I can hand over to you. So, okay.
Sure. So someone else was asking is, how do you kick off the test in ALM from Jenkins? Actually, this plugin is a really versatile plugin, and you can configure the Jenkins plugin to communicate with your ALM. I've never tried to have it communicate to multiple ALMs, so don't ask me that part. But when you tell it to talk to ALM, you basically tell it where your test set lives. So think if you're running your test direct from ALM today, you tell it where your test set lives. I believe it's by the folder path, so / wherever it is. And you can also set any ALM Lab Manager prerequisites and run it from Jenkins. It's really quite cool. I didn't expect it to work as well, but it's nice. And as I mentioned a moment ago, it's kind of neat because folks that may not have had the ability to do stuff in ALM based on availability, plugins, permissions, whatever, you actually can open that up to them in Jenkins if you wanted to. So hopefully that helped out.
Yeah, thanks for that, Chris. That's probably a good warm-up for you to start your part of it as well. I think we've covered all the questions today. If we haven't, by all means, people, just drop them into the chat window, and we'll do what we can to answer them online. So
yeah, keep the questions coming in.
Yep,
please.
And I'll keep driving the slides, Chris. So let me know when you want to advance.
Yeah. So when I was talking to Richard about his presentation, I said there's a lot of things to be aware of and to think about when preparing for your functional automation tests. And we can just dive into the next slide. So for example, what if you don't have continuous integration? What if you don't have DevOps? Or what if they're not in your control? What can you do? So this is let's try to be prepared for the integrations that are coming. Next slide, please.
Okay.
So there's a lot of different ways that we can think about readiness. The first thing is, we have to be aware of our script inventory. We have to, make sure that we have everything prepared. We have to be environment aware. We have to have our scripts configurable. We don't want a script that's just going to run in one place. We want to have, it so that it can run anywhere and everywhere. We want to have the ability to run our tests in all the kinds of different places. And we also want to be able to report out our results so that people can see those, and systems like Jenkins, as was just pointed out, can integrate with them. Next, please. So in terms of script inventory, I highly encourage that we publish our coverage. A lot of times when you're integrating with a process, whether it's DevOps, CI, or just working with the development team to test better in earlier environments, it's good to understand what your coverage capability is. Whether you do that based on, you could go crazy and do all kinds of heat maps. You can just list what's there, but it's just setting the expectations and understanding what capability do we have. So many times, you'll see companies where a development team and a testing team are working together towards the same goals, but they're not on common ground. Having your coverage published and available for people to look at is really helpful. And keep in mind, a lot of these points and tips that I'm talking about are so that we can be CI or DevOps ready. It doesn't mean you have to have it, doesn't mean it has to be in your control, but as responsible testers, we want to make sure that, the statement I make is, as a tester, I want to make sure that as, integration with this, that, or the other thing comes forward, that we're ready for it, that we can integrate. With your script inventory, you want to make sure that you have your key features addressed. You also want to think about smaller tests. You may not want to have a large end-to-end test running that's going to take 25 minutes. Maybe you can have some smaller, simpler tests that you're going to run that are going to run quickly. When it comes to errors, we want to make sure that we're descriptive. We don't want to just say that login failed. Maybe we can provide some more detail on it, so we can say maybe why login failed, or login for what scenario failed. In the examples that Richard was showing, integrating with Jenkins, as a developer looks at a failed pipeline, or anyone, it might be useful to understand more about what didn't work. So we want to be as descriptive as possible. And I highly encourage, when building your script inventory, to build it in a way of which you're aware of which of your scripts are read-only, meaning which scripts are just which script could you run over and over again with the same piece of data and have it be successful, and which ones are record-changing. I would imagine in Richard's world with banking that a majority of his scripts do use a record, or maybe he has the ability to reset. That's one thing I never necessarily take for granted, is the ability to reset, because a lot of our environments are continuously moving forward. And I don't have the ability to say, take me back 2 days so that my data is usable again. We have to have things available for us.
Yeah, it varies very much from environment to environment in terms of the testing that's done within the bank. And it can be really difficult. Test data management is one of those things that you get all your scripts ready and you think you're ready to test, and then you've got 5 days of data prep before you can actually do proper testing. And it's one of the areas that we're starting to do a lot more automation. One of the credit card businesses that we work with has done some really clever things in terms of checking out a piece of data, so when it's in use for one functional test, it can't be used for any others. So test 47 can't trip over test 159 that happens to be running at the same time. So those types of things are something that we're working on. The other thing is you might want to run a SQL script, for example, and pull data from a test environment and then put it into your test tool. And the more things that you can do like that are automated, the better, because managing, for developers, managing the code that they put in an environment is important, but for testers, it's the same. And if someone says, okay, we want to roll back and run the tests that we ran last week against last week's version of code, it's no good if you're just constantly overwriting your scripts. So script and test data management and version control is as important for good testing as it is for good software development.
No, I totally agree. And being CI aware is not just that our stuff is configured and running in something like Jenkins in your prior example, but that it runs well and it runs all the time. In fact, that's a great transition to our next slide, which talks about configuration. So in configuration, there are a couple of things to think about. One is your environment awareness. Your tests that you're putting forward should work just as well in all of your environments in your SDLC process. So you think about that diagram that Richard showed about, some dev environments working forward to your environments leading up to production. You need to make sure that your script can be functional in all of those. Now, based on what I said a moment ago about, I guess you'd say read-only versus transactional scripts, it is possible that some of them will only work in certain environments based on either data availability or your capability to do things in those environments. So we should be aware of what scripts are expected to work where. We want to have the environment either be something that can be built into the script and have it just know based on a thing, if that's available for you, or something that's configurable. For us, we do a lot of times via configuration. I'll show you a script in a minute, or a screenshot in a minute in ALM. Test data, as Richard was mentioning, is very important. It's something that you need to make the decision of, is your test just going to leverage data that's in a database somewhere? It's in a data table, or are you going to be greedy? Greedy data is the notion that your test is just going to do some data prerequisite and build data and just continue to hog up resources in the database or wherever your data is stored. Not necessarily a bad idea, but it can also slow down your tests. Do you want to wait to do some transaction to have it be able to insert or build all the data as necessary? Or do you want to be able to run a SQL query or other type of inquiry, whether it's via an API, that preps your tests and makes it ready? Another concept that we've tossed around is having the understanding of how much data we're going to use on a daily basis and to pre-build that data every day at like midnight so that the following day it has all the necessary data available for it. There's a lot of different techniques that can be done with test data, and it's just figuring out what process do you need and what do you want to do to make that work best for you.
Yeah, it's probably worth mentioning at that point, there's another SIG talk that's probably getting on for 6 months or so old now, where we talked about using Virtual Table Server, which is this free add-on for Load Runner and Performance Center that lots of people aren't even aware of, where basically you can install Virtual Table Server. It runs as a little database. It's very lightweight, sitting on a machine wherever you install it. And you can then tell your scripts to go there for the data, so they're not reliant on their own hard-coded data or data stored in a parameter file within the script. You can update that data repository much more readily because you can do it through a browser. And it's really good for the sort of scripts which you often get in banking, for example. You might have, or you will in health as well. Someone wants a new policy, for example, from Independent Health. They're going to go through a process where they fill out an application, and then there's going to be some back-end process where someone logs in and has a look and says, yeah, I approve. And then the third step of that business process might be a customer responding to an email and logging in with their new credentials. So you've got 3 scripts there. You can't run script 2 until you've run script 1, and you can't run script 3 until you've run script 2 as well. And scripts 2 and 3 both consume data from the scripts immediately before them. So that's a very good case where you want to get some clever test data management built into your continuous testing, and that's one of the ways you can do it. But obviously, Chris was mentioning others, and I'm sure there's plenty of ways you can do it. But that's one thing that might be worth looking up if people want to look at that previous SIG talk.
Yeah, that's a really great point, and I think it just shows that there are so many different options out there, and just being aware of what the problems that you have to solve are is highly important. In terms of ALM specific things, since this is a microfocus presentation or a visit presentation, there's ALM Test Lab, and there's features and capabilities that you can manage in there. You have AOT environment variables that are set in ALM, and you have test resources tied to their test configurations. I actually have some diagrams in the next couple of slides. We can look at the first one now that will show you these things in further detail. I've obviously blocked out things that are specific to our company, but you can see that once you set up the lab manager with ALM, you have the ability to tie and build environments. Those environments have different variables and values that you can set, and you can have one central considerate repository that you can build all of your pieces from. In the next slide, I show how you can use those. So when you're going to kick off a test, you choose the environment, and the environment pulls in all the necessary values so that whether it's a URL and a database name, a API endpoint URL, or other things that need to be pulled specific for environment, it's as easy as pulling them from this one central location. In addition, tied to Lab Manager, and this is very similar to how Jenkins can manage its nodes based on attributes, you have the ability to tag different variables, attributes, or tag the machines that you're going to run against, so that when you pull from your pool of machines, if you're looking for IE11, it pulls the appropriate machine. If you're looking for Edge, it pulls the appropriate machine. Obviously, we're not going to send a test that you want to run against Edge on a Windows 7 machine because it would never work. Making sure you pull appropriate things like that. It could also be whether or not it has a particular application or access that you need. Next slide.
Okay, there's a couple of questions coming as well, Chris. I don't know whether it's appropriate to answer them, but one of them is, hang on. As I was reading one question, another one came in, so there's now three. The first one is, what coverage level have you achieved, and do you still have any manual tests left which are performed within DevOps? I suppose the answer is that you're always striving to get rid of manual tests wherever possible, particularly if they're things you have to do regularly. But it's unlikely that any organization's ever completely got rid of all manual tests, but the goal is obviously to work towards that. I can't comment for my organization because I work in a central team supporting people who are doing this, and I don't really have much visibility of what they're doing, at the coalface. Do you have any comments to make on that, Chris?
I don't have specific numbers, but the two things I'll share is we actually look to do coverage based on priority of our tests. So we have a high level of coverage for priority 1s and priority 2s. But the other thing that we find too is with the growing number of applications and projects that are going on, specifically in healthcare with the ever-changing landscape that is out there, we are, I don't want to say constantly struggling to catch up. I'll kind of flip that around and say that we're giving plenty of opportunities to stay gainfully employed. And, what happens there is we are constantly building to our base and continually growing. We'll always likely have some level of manual tests, because another thing that we do is we evaluate whether or not something is a candidate for automation and whether or not it's worth the effort to build. So always be some level of manual tests, but we do strive to have a high level of coverage for our high priority and highly used tests. In addition, we've been striving to make it so that the majority of our tests are available in development region. And I think this covers another question that was asked, whereby an example of an area in healthcare. So enrollment is an area that is, really important, electronic enrollment. And I think we're at a 85% plus of our automation tests that tie to electronic enrollment are viable in nearly any environment. And as you can imagine, make for great strides in testing of patches, fixes, upgrades, and other things in development. As we're running a little short on time, I'm going to fly through the next couple slides, as there's just some key points to mention, and then we can tackle the last couple questions at the end.
Okay.
So execution readiness. This is pretty simple, but just something to consider. Making sure we have enough machines available, whether they're virtual, physical, provisionable in the cloud. Those are decisions that you have to make on your own. But just thinking about, I'm going to tie into a process that's going to require me to kick off 5 tests at a time. Do I have enough availability for that? For that availability, is it okay to queue? I don't know. I can't answer that question for individuals, but we want to make sure that that's a thought that you've come up with. And in terms of readiness as well, so we've been talking about Jenkins quite a bit, but I think knowing your APIs, knowing how you can integrate with things is important. If there was this brand new server out there called Alfred, just to pick up on the whole Butler theory of things, would it be available for us to integrate with? Understanding your APIs, understanding how to remotely connect and interface with your tools, whether it's batch scripts, REST APIs, or other things, it is important. Think of it like this. I'm on a computer. can I kick off my test with a command of some sort or a trigger? If so, you're that much closer to being ready. Next. So the final thing to mention, then we'll kind of dive into the rest of the questions, is just reports and metrics. So it's not good enough for a test to run, but we need to make sure that the appropriate information is coming back to whatever that is. Simple pass-fail is likely going to be necessary for a CI tool like Jenkins or TFS build server, or there's another popular one out there, Team City versus other things. But having the detailed results being able to be integrated with there, as Richard even pointed out as a demonstration, you saw the pass, but you could see that there was a full detail in there. It's quite wonderful for digging into understanding your coverage, as well as being able to understand where a failure may have occurred. Maybe you want to integrate with some kind of log analysis, but just knowing that you have to plan for your reports, plan for building all of those pieces is very necessary. So kind of in summary, the various levels of readiness that I wanted to have a chance to discuss is your script inventory and configuration. Very important to make sure that you know what's out there, that you know that you can run it over and over again. In your configuration, being able to tie into environments and to be aware of your test data needs, your execution capability, making sure that you know what kind of environments your test need to run on it can indeed run, and then the results and reports that come back. I think we have a couple minutes. We can go a moment or two over. There's a couple questions that came in.
Okay.
Maybe we can tackle those quick.
Yeah, one of the questions it's in two parts, and so I'll tackle the second part first. But this basically says our teams consider themselves to be agile, but most don't do their own performance testing, but turn to a central testing service to do performance testing. This obviously doesn't scale, but teams are reluctant to take on the challenges of performance testing. That's common, and interestingly, that's exactly what Micro Focus do. I was at a presentation that the head of their ADM division made recently, and he said that they've put testing into the development teams for everything apart from performance, and they still maintain a specialized, centralized performance testing team because there are some unique skills and difficulties and challenges around performance testing, and it does make sense to maintain some centralization. Having said that, it doesn't mean that people earlier in the development cycle shouldn't be using some form of performance testing. So whether that's running performance regression tests against an API using LoadRunner, for example, early in the life cycle, so that when your developers who are handing over to testers for that final formal auditable test can have some confidence that it's going to work. So there's several ways you can do it, but centralized performance testing teams are still very common, and it is a very good way of helping share knowledge between specialists within that particular field. He also asks, is there a good reference document for application delivery teams to use to get started doing their own performance testing? Sadly, I'm not really aware of one. Performance testing is one of those fields that you don't tend to just pick up and start doing. It is relatively complex. What I would recommend, rather than finding a reference document, is try and find an approachable performance tester and get them to sit down with your developers and do some quick and easy performance tests that they can learn. I mean, they're developers. They're going to know about code. They're going to know about how to get things to work and automation frameworks and all those kind of things. Try and do some knowledge transfer so that ultimately the performance testers in your organization will benefit from that, because they're not just going to be ended up with a whole load of testing to do at the end of a life cycle. They can have some confidence that developers have done things earlier. So maybe a little bit of cross-pollination would be good. And thank you, Chris. I see you've answered the question as well by saying there's a free ebook which talks about high levels, talks about this at a high level. Effective performance engineering is the thing that you should Google for, and I forgot that one of our co-directors is the author of that, so I really should have known better. I should have mentioned that.
Oh, that's fine. In fact, there was a webinar last year I could find the link and re-promote it. If you follow me on LinkedIn, I'll try to re-promote it, where there was an individual who talked about how they managed central performance engineering and how they basically treated them. So, I mean, they were a centralized team, but how they created a process for, let's call it, managing the chaos. It wasn't chaos for them anymore because they had built a process around, you know, handling the applications. And a very key factor that I remember from that was building known acceptance criteria for what does it take to be able to enter the pipeline of having something get performance testing, because there's an awful lot of application maturity that needs to exist before you're ready for that. It can't be a, let's call it a half-cocked idea that's built that says, well, we need to performance test this. Well, we need to understand what the product is doing. You know, the level of maturity of your product definitely falls into place for performance testing and certainly for functional testing as well.
Yeah. Okay, I think we should probably think about wrapping up because we've got 3 questions left, so we won't take any more. But there's one where somebody asked, how many test automation engineers do we have, and how many applications are tested? I don't know the exact numbers, but we definitely have hundreds of test automation engineers at the bank, testing thousands of applications. We're a very big organization. There's around 18,000 people in the software sort of engineering and test environments and environments management people and so on. So we're a large organization, so that's obviously not going to be common for everybody. But a related question is, are our test automation engineers skilled to develop both UFT and load runner type scripts? Some of them are, but that's the exception rather than the norm. And one final question is, running a performance test for a short amount of time triggered by Jenkins isn't good because it won't capture memory leaks, for example, and long-running tests. That's very true. That was a very short demo. The way I would envisage this being used for formal testing would be to run a series of tests, proven environments up and running, and then potentially kick off a prolonged duration test overnight. That's probably best practice. But perhaps we should have made that clear, because I don't want to give people the impression that they can do a complete performance test of their application in a few minutes.
Yeah, I think there's a distinct difference between a very small test that will let you understand the kind of feel of things versus the more fulfilling test that's going to occur later in your life cycle. I think the idea that you're trying to illustrate, Richard, is that why bother getting into that big test if the basic test doesn't work? Think of it as like a smoke test for performance.
Yeah, it's perfect for smoke tests. It's also perfect for if you've got something that isn't a complex business process, like testing an API or web service, something like that. You know, you can hit an API with 5,000 requests in a few minutes. That's a valid test to see how an API might respond, particularly if you're doing kind of regression testing to make sure that changes that you've made haven't degraded the performance of a particular API or service. So thank you for stopping and asking questions, because we're getting to the stage where we're running out of time. I appreciate those of you who are still on the call. I'll just tell you now briefly about a few other events that Vivit's involved in. One of the things that we didn't talk about in this presentation was security testing, but again, that's something that can be automated. You can use Fortify, for example, under Jenkins control. There are plugins specifically for security testing, for example. So if you're interested in security testing, or you know people who are, they may be interested to hear of the Cybersecurity Summit, which is happening in Washington, DC towards the end of September. If you are interested in that, please register using the link that comes in the Vivit email. We're keen to demonstrate to Microfocus how Vivit members are interested and engaged in attending these types of events. We've also got a few webinars coming up. I'll tell you a little about those. One of them is tomorrow. So if Chris and I haven't bored you with webinars and you fancy another one, there's one related to software QA tomorrow, talking about value stream integration and how it can improve QA. We've got one coming up in August talking about cloud integration, so OpenStack Cloud and integration with SUSE Linux. And then the final one to mention is around total view analytics within ALM. So that's in September. The other thing that you'll get after this email, as well as an email of thanks saying thank you for attending, is a request to complete a survey. It would be great to get your feedback around this SIG talk. You can let us know what we did well, what we did badly. And if you're interested in talking or sharing some of your experiences, which we would definitely encourage, please complete that survey that will also be in the email that goes out to you. It's great for people to share experiences, and that's something that we're looking to encourage within Vivid. So thank you once again for attending, and I think that wraps it up. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Richard. Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Yeah, thank you. Goodbye.